There you go, webinar today to find more about Building Belonging, our collaborative online change impact programme that we will be going live with from September onwards this year. What we decided to do, I'm Juliette Morgan, should start there. So I have leadership and oversight of this programme. I'm responsible for its design and also for the delivery alongside one of our associates, Sally Bradley, who's been involved in our Building Belonging projects for some considerable time. So we decided we were going to host a webinar to give all of you some information. This Belonging Change Impact Programme has been something we've been running for a couple of years now, and it has had garnered lots of interest and has had consecutive support from institutions signing up and taking part. And it's of no surprise, really, given the current climate and the rise in terms of mental health and well-being and the discussion in the sector and the research and evidence base about belonging, mattering and connection, that we've got lots and lots of interest in what will be the fourth cohort of this Change Impact Programme. So what we're going to do today, I'm delighted to welcome a couple of colleagues, Chris Powis and Ollie Young. They are people that have been on the Change Impact Programme in previous iterations, and I'm delighted that they're here to support us today and give you guys some more information about the Change Impact Programme cohort that they were on, and their sort of decisions to join that, and what happened as they took part, and some impact related information back into their context. So without further ado, and because I'm conscious that Chris Powis has to leave us at 1 o'clock, thanks very much for joining us. I'm actually going to hand over to those guys before I take on the second half of today's webinar. So Chris, over to you.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm Chris Powis, and I'm Director of Library Learning and Student Services at the University of Northampton, and I was one of a triumvirate who managed and ran and led our programme, which was in the second cohort. And my colleagues were Kate Coulson, who then was the head of Learning and Teaching Engagement, Enhancement, until she left the university in January for a different job. And Michelle Hodnicki, who was the Assistant Director of Estates and Campus Services. So we had a steering group of three that were quite high level and represented both the academic and professional service areas in the university. And we then recruited through various means, some just word of mouth, some because we knew people are interested and lent on them a bit, about 40 staff to form an actual steering group. So that's quite big. That was quite a lot of people to control, in inverted commas, if you control anybody in the university. But we got that many because we wanted people who were interested. So all of these people said they were interested. We didn't want to put anybody off. And we also wanted representatives from some of the areas that don't get involved in this sort of thing normally, like finance. So we had the finance department, HR, and people like that, as well as academics and the professional services you would expect, like estates and library and student services and so on. So that's where I come to this from. So I'm one of that, effectively one of that group of 40, but I was one of the three named people who were leading on it. So why was Northampton involved? We'd been doing initiatives or taking out initiatives, as I'm sure you've been, that you could characterize as belonging for a long time. We just didn't call them that. So we looked at car parking, and we didn't call that belonging, but it is, or it contributes towards it potentially. So we've been doing these projects, but in 2018 we moved campuses. So we sold off our 2 existing campuses and built a completely new one close to the town centre in Northampton. And that was, as you can imagine, a massive disruptor. And it was a disruptor in lots of ways, good ways, because we could start from scratch in our campus design, but it also disrupted a lot of the things that helped people feel they belonged to a place. So your commute was different. My commute was different. After many years, I had to go a different way because it was in a different place. The buildings that I'd become attached to, or not, as the case may be, were changed. The leisure facilities were changed. There was a different sports hall. It was all of those things had changed. So it was a big disruptor. We were getting used to that, and then COVID came, and that added another layer of disruption onto this. So we'd been in the new campus for about 16 months. So we felt, as we came back from COVID, that we needed to address belonging with a capital B, and joining this project was an obvious place to give us that oomph to do so, and give us that sense that we were part of something bigger than simply just looking at the new campus, because we've done a lot of initiatives that were characterized as the new campus. Actually, as you will know, belonging is much bigger than the physical space. So we wanted to go capital B. So that's why we signed up. We also didn't want to do it on our own. We wanted to be part of a community looking at this, because we are great believers in the wisdom of crowds and the wisdom of networks. So we wanted to do it as part of a bigger picture across the sector, if possible. So what we wanted to do was not have another project. We'd had projects, as I described, in various things, and particularly around the build of the new campus and the design of the buildings and so on. So we were doing projects. We would continue to do projects that you could call belonging. What we wanted to go for was culture change. So we wanted effectively to do two things. One is to define belonging for us. What did that mean in a Northampton context? And once we'd got that, we could then start embedding belonging into the discourse of the university. So it should then become part of everything else. Once we knew what we were talking about with it, it could appear as part of the learning and teaching strategy. It could appear as part of the estate strategy. It could appear when you are in a workshop on assessment and feedback. It's all part of that, but we knew then under a common definition, we'd know what we were talking about. So rather than a project around commuter students or a project around first years or whatever it was, we wanted to change that culture so it was part of our everyday discourse. I'll say whether we think we did that in a minute, but we found real value in working across the university. Having these 40 odd people was great, because it meant that some areas that are crucial to that, like finance, particularly the student finance, were part of it. We didn't have to go and seek them out. They were already there. But also working with Advanced HE and other institutions, we wanted that sector connection, and it gave us that. The workshops were great, not just in what we learned from them and got from them, but the networking, the hearing how others had faced barriers, some different to us and some the same, how we'd settle, how they'd approach those. Didn't mean we did the same, but you learn, oh my God, I wouldn't do that sometimes, because it wouldn't work here. I don't mean because anybody came up with anything bizarre. But that sense of networking and being part of something bigger was great. And you get things that you don't expect. So I got a really good recommendation for a keynote speaker over tea at the final meeting in Birmingham, just chatting to somebody from Lincoln. I wouldn't have got that otherwise. And that person was brilliant. And the conference, Learning and Teaching Conference, was actually on belonging. So it was perfect all round. So did we get what we wanted out of it? Yes. We have a definition. That was the relatively easy bit. It took a whole day workshop with Advanced HE, but we got a definition. And it is now part of the discourse of the university. It's one of the 4 central planks in our new learning and teaching strategy that came out in June. It's part of other initiatives and strategies that we've been working on over the last year. So we're part of a drug and alcohol impact project. It's part of that. The University Mental Health Charter, which we're working towards. Belonging is now talked about within that. It was always part of it, but it's talked about within it. It's in the estate strategy and elsewhere. So it is part of the discourse. Now, you can barely go to a meeting without somebody talking about belonging and talking about it in a way that the rest of the university understands, rather than in a very narrow sense. Personally, I got a huge amount out of it. I like it's an area I'm passionate about anyway, but actually being part of a wider community of other people who are passionate about it is personally very satisfying for me, both internally in the university and as part of the project. It's given us a framework and an impetus to build on existing work. So we will not stop because the project has ended. We'll not stop networking, but we'll also not stop building on that groundwork that we've done as part of the project. And I believe it will continue to impact on UON staff and students as we move into quite difficult times. And I should have said, actually, at the start, we didn't make this a student belonging project. It has always been about belonging for students and staff. If staff don't feel they belong, then we haven't got much hope with students, have we? So it was explicitly that from the start as well. So we have had HR, we've looked at HR policies and so on as part of this. So I think that's probably my time up. And I'm happy to answer questions, but possibly after Ollie would make more sense, wouldn't it?
Thank you very much, Chris. Clearly from a very biased position, it's always so lovely to hear from people in such a positive way. But importantly, the impact contextually to University of Northampton is really important. And I think most of the questions that business development and myself field when people are thinking about joining projects that we have running or not are around how might we make this work for us, and what sort of investment on return on investment will we get from an impact perspective. And as you know, Advanced HE are really wedded to reach, value and impact. Those are our fundamental planks of any fellowship application, amongst other things. So it's really good to hear, Chris, about the reach, value and impact of University of Northampton's involvement on building belonging, and that continued space and place that's safe for authentic dialogue, to forge ahead more interventions and plans and perhaps make those more robust going ahead, even though your time on the project has come to an end. So thank you so much for sharing that. Chris is going to leave us at 1 o'clock. So I've popped a note in the chat to say if you have any specific questions for Chris and Ollie and or myself, you can utilise the chat function. But before I go to Ollie, just because I know that Chris may well have to leave, is there anything specific around Chris's information that anyone would like to ask, just in case Chris has to go? Feel free to camera on, raise your hand.
There is a question in the chat. So the specific things is to get people talking about it in their perspective. So rather than impose a top-down sense of what belonging is, I mean, you should never do belonging to people anyway. I mean, that was one of the big takeaways from the very first meeting. Somebody said that, but you don't do belonging. If you involve a department, if you've got, say, I don't know, mental health and counselling, you get them to talk about what belonging means in their context, because it will be different to what that means to the business school, and you bring them in to a wider meeting so those perspectives are shared. And that's where we had the 40 people, and it had to be online, which, although we did have one meeting face to face, but if you get people to actually talk about it to other people and then work towards that shared definition, I think. But don't tell them what belonging is. Let them come out with what belonging means.
Thanks, Chris. There's a specific question about belonging and curriculum design and some perspectives from the students, which I think we're going to, well, I know that we're going to cover in terms of our later conversation.
If I can just say with students, those 40 people included significant student representation. We didn't leave students out, so they were their voice was there. Sense of belonging in curriculum design. Academics brought that to the steering group, but also we have it as part of our framework. So we've just reaccredited with Advanced AG. Actually, literally just this past. We sent in our homework, our corrections 2 days ago. So we've reaccredited, and as part of that, belonging is now fundamental to what we do. So that's how it's part of curriculum design, and talking about curriculum. But we do have in my area we have learning designers, and they are on board with this and as a part of this.
A couple of other questions, Chris.
Yeah.
Not everyone in the 40 people were enrolled on the course. I'm going to pick that up once Ollie's given us some insight.
No,
go ahead.
No, they were internal. It was an internal group. Yeah, they're not enrolled. No.
And student perspective, we advocate in design and certainly in institutional kind of membership that actually the students are an equal and crucial part in the involvement of the project, and they are, as standard, invited to all of the workshop and delivery that's available. Getting people there is always tricky, but from the get-go, Advanced HE and institutions that we work with have a sense of kind of agreement, really, an expectation that the student voice will be an equal and very valuable voice in the process.
And I'm pleased to say that is the Northampton way anyway. So we did that. And the capital B is when we'd got the definition. So the capital B for Northampton is our definition of belonging. Doesn't mean you can't subtly have a lowercase b if you're in a particular department, that as long as it meets the ethos, but effectively the capital B belonging is the definition.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
I can't see any more specific questions in the chat. So at that point, I'm going to offer my thanks to you because I think you might leave just at 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
And Chris has written us a case study as well, which we're intending to publish. So watch out for that. There'll be slightly more information around Chris's Northampton story once we publicise the case study there. So thanks, Chris, for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to Ollie Young from the University of Exeter to give some insight, again, the same really, on their involvement with the Building Belonging project. And again, if you have specific questions, please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand, turn your cameras on. We're real advocates of having, although we're online, a real sense of sort of shared engagement and community here. So don't shy away from us. Ollie.
Thanks, Jules, and thanks, Chris, as well. I think everything you said resonated with the experience I've had here at Exeter, and I think I'll come back to that point in particular when we start talking about the collaborations. So, as Jules said, Oliver Young, Associate Dean for Taught Students, and also the Chief Diversity Officer in the business school, particularly. So, I have one role that sort of spans the institution, and then one that's in a specific context. And I'll sort of highlight why I've mentioned those two in a second. So just to give a quick overview of our institution, like Chris and every other institution in the sector, COVID, massive impact on the way we operate, specific challenges around how do you actually get students and staff to re-engage and be involved on campus, particularly after a prolonged period of working remotely. We also had an institutional restructure, so we had 6 colleges. We went to 3 faculties afterwards. So where disciplines and programs had a bit of a unique identity, they were standalone. They then found themselves sort of re-emerging from that restructure, shoehorned into other areas that they may not necessarily work with before. So that was something fundamental to take on board. Then equally, just thinking about the institutional drivers, like as I mentioned before, one of the key areas that I look after is student voice, engagement and experience. And part of that is something we call the students as change agents, initiative, and I'll come to that one again a little bit later on. But equally though, like most of the operators in the sector, we're seeing an increase in reliance on diversifying our cohorts via international students. Many institutions are bringing up widening participation or access and participation plans. So therefore, the nature of the students that we're actually engaging with is changing. But equally, so are our staff. So I love the fact that Chris and Jules alluded to the fact that there's a lot of focus on students, but actually, if you think about staff delivering that experience, then fundamentally they also need to be included in that as well. And one of my key passions, as I mentioned before, was students as change agents, and that's really about empowering students to actively participate in shaping their own educational experience. One of my philosophies is that education isn't done to people, they are actively involved in it. That's part of their participation, that's part of the authenticity that Jules referred to earlier. Obviously, with the Chief Diversity Officer role in the business school, that's basically EDI. But actually, I'm quite passionate about just extending that a bit further. It's DEI and B, capital B, lowercase b. I don't mind, but that B is important. And I'll come back to that particular point a little bit later on as well, because I think there's some key learnings for the institution around that's the acronym that we need to take on board. So I think fundamentally joining this, so I'll talk about the institutional motivation and then also the collaboration piece sort of together. But I think it's important to mention that it was an opportunity for us to think around how we discuss, test, and shape our initiatives. In our institution, quite a big institution, we've got two main campuses in different areas. So we've got Devon, with Streatham, and we've got something like 28,000 students on that particular campus, and that's spread between St Luke's and Streatham. Then we've also got a campus in Cornwall, down in Penryn, that has students at Truro and also at Penryn. And then the Penryn site is also a collaboration with Falmouth University. So they all have a very unique context. They all have a particular way of operating. So for us, really trying to identify in this evolving environment how we enable students to feel that they belong and staff feel that they can belong and also support students is fundamental. So a strong emphasis on co-creation, and I think really it's a big passion of mine, and all colleagues know that's my particular view. It's around shaping student experiences. And I think that in itself is a bit of a negative, because obviously I'm trying to lead this change, I'm trying to drive this, but this is one individual who's doing that. And this is where the collaboration piece comes in. I think we're heavily involved in a sector that relies on external validation. So it's okay me doing great work within my institution. It's only when it's recognized externally that people start to think, oh, well, actually, maybe there is a point here. So I think that was something that was fundamental for me, and that's where the collaboration came in. But equally on top of that also is almost like that oversight, external oversight. And I was great to see that Advanced HE, one of the key players in the sector, was leading this particular project, and we were participating, and they can have their input. And a part of the program, we received a report that talked about the particular journey that the University of Exeter went on. So that validation is fundamental for me. And I think at a multi-institutional level, so we had a very broad cross-section of institutions, some focusing on postgraduate, some on undergraduate, and so on and so forth. I think it was good to sort of see the different dynamic. So moving on to the experience, I think it goes without saying, belonging is a cycle, and every institution, regardless of the nature of the makeup of the institution or where they are in their life cycle, they're on a different point of that cycle, that journey. And I think it was good to sort of hear from some institutions that are a bit further down the journey than us, and equally some that were sort of coming up, and just seeing how there were differences there. I think, like Chris mentioned, our key challenge really was having that institutional understanding, having that insight of what belonging actually is, who's involved in it, and how we can, help create an environment, a place where this could be taken forward. So that was initially our starting point. We created an online multi-stakeholder engagement, a whole day engagement led by Advanced HE. We had 60 participants. students, very strong representation from students, the unions. So as I mentioned before, we've got the Guild in Exeter, and we've got sort of like the FX Plus, which is a combination of Falmouth and Exeter in Penryn. We had representation there. We had a very large number of students, postgraduate, undergraduates, professional service colleagues, and academics, all sort of throwing in as an expert group to sort of help move the institution in the direction of belonging. A couple of things that brought to my attention as a project lead. Really, like many things, you're going to have the naysayers, and you're going to have those that are advocate for this work, and even then they're on a spectrum. And whilst I may be at one end of that spectrum, really positive and really trying to drive this for the student experience, equally there will be counterparts, some of whom are senior within the institution, who didn't really understand it. They just think, well, belonging will be derived from them just learning their content, attending their seminar sessions and lectures and so on and so forth. And that's belonging because they're here, they're doing the work. Whereas actually, when you think about the nature of the students, they're bringing a hell of a lot more, I don't mean baggage, but they're bringing a lot more life to our institutions. Some of the students are online, some of them are going to be international, some of them are going to be care leavers, caregivers, some of them are going to be from low socioeconomic status. Some of them are going to have, protected characteristics that we need to observe. So how do we create an environment for them? And that's why I talked about the DEI and B bit, which I'll come to again in a short while. So really, I think the overarching things that I would like to have achieved with this project, and I did on many of those, really talked around trying to get the organisation to understand the different identities and the complex makeup that has, thinking around how this project can be used as provocations so that the concept of belonging can actually be embedded in every single aspect or every single touch point that our students, irrespective of their identity or background, can actually engage with. So I think whilst we've got lots of projects happening within the institution, and one negative that we did observe is a project we stood up, it will run its cycle, it then be stood down, and then that knowledge is then sort of polished and hidden away somewhere. And expertise that could actually further that project or be used to run a different cycle in a different context would not be able to be utilized. So the key idea then really is, how do we centralize that? How do we make sure that we can learn from previous iterations of projects that we've had in the institution? So something around centralizing our efforts. There was also something around having a stronger consideration for staff. I think that was fundamental because, like I said before, having a diverse range of academics within our community, they also need to belong as well in some way, shape or form. So really it's how do we understand that and work with that? And I think the project helps sort of clarify those different areas, those different ideas. And I'm still going through a lot of the findings from that day workshop that we did, and also the report as well. So what I've observed critically is that the concept of belonging is actually still evolving and will continue to evolve over time. I'm seeing the concept of belonging being, talked about quite heavily within the unions, within education provision. We're going through a project called Curriculum for Change, which I'm not going to go into, but we're building a series of design principles, and now belonging has emerged, which is great. Chris alluded to the mental health charter and the work towards that. Belonging sits front and center, although I can't claim credit for that. A colleague of mine, Linda, who's leading on that, also strongly believes in the concept and how we should be using that to improve the welfare of our students. One other thing to quickly mention as well. So as part of that journey, we're kind of getting to grips with the diversity. Exeter has a particular identity or brand, and certain students find it easier to apply for, enter. And as we start to diversify and we start to bring in different identities within our community, it's important that we understand that. So we've got some great initiatives that sort of help with the diversity. We've also got some great initiatives that sort of level the playing field, some equity-based initiatives for specific groups. The one bit that I did observe that was a challenge was the inclusion bit. And whilst we think we're doing well in belonging, if that inclusion bit hasn't been fully understood and addressed, then the idea of belonging would not really be reached. So that's and I'm making it sound like it's just a benchmark or a threshold. We've reached a certain level of belonging, all is good. I think that is fundamental. If we understand the identities of the different cohorts, different colleagues that we have, then we can work with them in a stronger way to actually create that environment that works. So as I said, much of the work that we've done is still a work in progress. For me, it's like a relay race. I'm the current custodian. of that baton, and I'm going to pass it on very soon, actually. So I'm not going to see the end of the race, but I know that body of work is going to continue because there are other champions that have emerged through this body of work that are now taking hold of that and trying to implement it within their own bodies of work. So I'll stop there. There's a lot to talk about, clearly, but if there are any specific questions, again, feel free to either drop them in the chat or unmute and raise hand and ask, etc., etc. So I'll stop, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Ollie, again, for giving such an insightful account of your own context and why working with us on this project has been really beneficial and impactful for you. The custodian of the torch, I really like in terms of that phrase, because I'm a fundamental believer in belonging being just that sort of the notion of passing that baton over, and with every pass, there's a new frame of reference or a slightly different lens that will build on what's existing and make better for those that are here with us now and who are yet to arrive in our own institutions. So, I really liked that. I'm going to coin that. I'll reference you, of course. We have a message in the chat, Ollie. So how many people did you have in your belonging group and what departments were included?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, in the group, there were 60 individuals invited. They couldn't all spend the entirety of the day. Where were they from? So I think from our Cornwall site, we had 10 students and I think 9 from Exeter. We had, I think, 6 members of the Students' Union in Penryn, and we had something like 5 from Exeter, and then we had 1 or 2 employed members of the guild in Exeter, and then the rest were made up of staff, so a balance of academics and also professional services in different roles. So in terms of departments, we had engineering, we had mining down in Penryn, we had some from management, we had some from psychology, all with varying understanding and expertise in belonging. I mean, our colleagues from psychology really got it. They really understood it. They were dealing with that on a day-to-day. Our colleagues in our student welfare teams, accessibility teams that deal with individual learning plans or like study contracts, that kind of thing, to support students with accessibility considerations. They really had a strong understanding of how our endeavours kind of impact upon that. And then we had some other colleagues, not in those particular areas, I'm not going to mention them, who had a significantly lower understanding of belonging. So much to say that, in their view, if you just took a student to the pub and buy them a drink when they first start, that's building belonging. Not really. Look at identity. Some can't engage with alcohol and so on and so forth. So a real spectrum of understanding, a real spectrum of expertise or engagement. But yeah, it's quite a broad selection of colleagues from the institution.
Thanks, Ollie. At this point, there are no further questions in the chat at the moment, but is there anything that anybody is thinking or holding in their minds whilst we've been listening to Ollie speak that you might want to ask or perhaps share? If you wanted to use the chat, camera on, feel free to operate that way. Can't see anyone immediately responding. So I will give some sort of broader information around cohort 4. Just before I do, Patrick, thank you very much. What kind of support or representation were you able to garner from senior leadership? And did you feel this was important to delivering programme or ideas?
It's really interesting, actually. So in the first instance, the most obvious one, and particularly in the current climate, with institutions going through voluntary severance or redundancy programs and so on and so forth, the finance is a significant thing. And in my particular role, I didn't actually have a budget. I don't have a budget, although I do have costs that are taken care of centrally. So I did go out on a mission to beg, borrow, steal, and I actually went to the provost and just said, look, I've got this thing. Everyone knows this is what I'm about. This is what I'm interested in doing. It's part of my role, but equally I have a wider belief in it. I do feel, though, that this is something that we need to undertake as an independent piece of work. So it's actually, you know, taken away from me as an individual. It's a body of work in its own right. It just so happens to have a very broad stakeholder engagement. And I think going through that I mean, it was quite painful to create some of the groups that we had, because, you know, I looked without making a final point, I did allude to inclusion and having voices in the room. The first list of expert group members were, well, let's just put it this way, it wasn't very diverse. And I had to challenge that. I had to push back and say, no, we need to address that, because the very voices that we need to have in the room are being excluded from this conversation. And we need to understand what the pain points for them are. And that came through in the body of work that we did through the workshops and the research that we undertook and the reports that were produced from that. And then equally the report that came from Advantage, there were areas of difference, but it was the fact that we had that external endorsement for the work that we're trying to do. There was also referrals to other institutions that are going on. There was a previous cohort before us, because we were cohort 2. And obviously we can see additional cohorts coming through now. So it just goes to show how wide and important this is. The other thing that's really important is that I mentioned curriculum for change as a body of work that we're going through at the present moment in the institution. And I received an email from the DVC for education and student experience, talking about how we need to start thinking about creating design principles for belonging, which never occurred before. So having that report, seeing the nature of what's happening in the conversations, seeing the program that we had, because we had keynotes from sector operators, both in professional services, students, but also 1K Chi. The DVC actually referred to Tim Dickinson in 1K Chi about how belonging is important. But that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been part of this program and having that external report produced to say, actually, these are the fundamental things that we need to work on. So in terms of gaining the leverage or leveraging the senior leadership support, important, because if it was just me standing on the mountaintop shouting, I'd just be ignored.
And thanks, Ollie. You've made reference to final reports. So as part of the involvement on the programme, institutionally, we issue a survey to take account of your own context institutionally at the beginning of your involvement. And we analyse the data from that survey throughout your time on the programme. So we give you some initial information through a consultancy call. And then we utilise that data in the construction of your institutional final report. So the report that Ollie's referencing is about you in your institution and your involvement on the belonging project, and information that has come both from your survey and from your workshops and from being involved through the programme. And its intention is that it benchmarks kind of you and who you are and what you've done and some of your data against some of the outputs from the collaborative programme, so that it gives you a foothold to then continue or further develop the work that you need back into your own contexts, just to make that transparent, Ollie.
And just one last thing to add also, towards the end of that report from the Advantage that Juliette and the team have curated, there are also actually some tips and some pointers and considerations, things that we may need to consider as we continue on this journey. And that equally is built up on, I mean, there are some amazing frameworks that were shared within our cohort that actually kind of gives an insight to some of our senior leadership in terms of, actually, here are the provocations for the work that we need to do and why. And I think we wouldn't have had that, excuse me, if we hadn't engaged in the collaboration. I mean, to have the broad, I mean, you know, fine, I'm at Exeter, we had colleagues from literally all over the sector in the UK who had a variety of levels of advancement in this body of work, and to go out individually and try and engage with all those individuals would be damn near impossible. So the amount of work that we've managed to achieve in the time frame that we've done it, I think it just goes without saying it's fundamental. So it's a robust piece of work. So thank you.
Thank you, Ollie. That's no problem, Patrick. Thanking you for answering that question. So some overarching in the last couple of minutes kind of principles really of building belonging for is that Lucy has shared above in the chat, my colleague, the link to the Advanced HE webpage, where many of you will have clicked register your interest, which is why one of the reasons why you're here today. That gives you some bespoke information around the project itself, some key information. We limit it to 12 institutions. The project team that Chris and Ollie have made reference to is the leadership kind of project team, which we limit to 4 places. This project, Cohort 4, will make use of an online learning management system. So we have thought about the digital sustainable offer here, and you will therefore have access to our learning management system, and all of the involvement and interaction in the programme will come through that platform. And that therefore means that we are just asking you to just be considerate of the technical capabilities to participate fully in Cohort 4. So we will make use of Zoom, for example, for calls and chats and breakout rooms and lots of other facilities on our learning management platform for you to use. So essentially it's structured via your engagement with the platform, with a survey that is again hosted through the learning management platform, some consultation calls that take place with myself around your survey data, and then we bring you together in a launch event online, and then we have structured and designed a number of workshops which both Chris and Ollie have made reference to for you to engage in and then situate back into your own context. And we have a closing event at the end of that, where all of the institutions are, amongst other things, able to come and talk about their own institutional projects. And we can tackle the difficult questions, and we can network and collaborate to think about how we might move that forward when the project is finished. So we've also designed a framework, the student needs framework, which we will be introducing to this cohort. We have piloted that with our current cohort, Cohort 3, which is currently ongoing, which will give you access to a way of thinking about service redesign or service design for students, thinking about space, place, time, community, and people and individuals when we're thinking about belonging, mattering, connection, and crucially inclusion. So the learning management system will make sense of that for you, and will structure your own involvement in the programme by dipping you in and out of various segments of that framework whilst you're in design for perhaps your other frameworks institutionally or contextually, and making use of the research and evidence base that's out there. I think there's a question, and Ollie's answered it. Thank you so much. How many people? I'm conscious of time. I'm a big fan of not keeping people beyond where they think they might be kept. Are there any more specific questions around this Change Impact Programme that you haven't got the information you wanted from listening to Chris, Ollie, and latterly myself give you some brief information? If you wanted to raise your hand or utilise the chat, we could pick that up at this point. I can't see anyone that's asking anything. Okay, in which case, thank you so much to Chris, who's had to leave, and to Ollie, who is still here with us, for giving us such insight, and to all of you for giving us your time today, really, to be interested in and find out more about the Building Belonging Collaborative programme. We have recorded this session, so we will be sending that out to all of you, and getting in touch with you at some point down the route for some follow-up. So if you've got questions that you'd like to ask, then certainly we will be touching base with you. But feel free to utilise the contact that you've already had through our business development, and have answered any questions that you might have not had answered today. We are live for sign-ups. If you wanted to do that, then we'd be delighted to work with you, and we hope to see as many of you as possible at some point down the route into the future. If not on this Change Impact Programme, then through the course of our other work for Advanced HE. Thank you very much.